Madam President, each year the United Nations in New York has a General Assembly meeting, and countries come with their leaders from all around the world. Many people, myself included, watch 60 Minutes on Sunday. So last night, 60 Minutes, Vladimir Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, talked about what he's facing with this Russian invasion by Putin and what it's meant to his country. And he said that he's coming to New York to make a presentation to the United Nations. I think it's important that he does this. I want him to remind the American people who through the NATO alliance have been steadfastly in support of the Ukrainian people what's at stake. Madam President, Vladimir Putin has said he wants to restore Russians' so-called lost glory. That is the twisted rationale behind his disastrous invasion of Ukraine, one that has led to nearly 500,000 Ukrainians and Russians being killed or wounded simply for Putin's bloodthirsty ambition. Putin will not be traveling much outside Russia. If you wonder why, it's because the International Criminal Court, when it looked at the activity of the Russian invaders in Ukraine, ended up arresting or branding Vladimir Putin a war criminal. Why would they call him a war criminal? Because they killed innocent civilians, certainly, but equally because they had a mass abduction of Ukrainian children into Russia, something that has hardly ever happened in history, but Putin has done it. So they issued an arrest warrant for Putin over the war crimes. It is the first time in history for a leader of one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council to be so charged. It's no surprise when you see what he's done and what he threatens to do. Putin has isolated Russia. He has arrested Russians for political dissent. He has quashed the freedom of the press, and he is destroying the Russian economy. Despite these clearly tragic outcomes, he is doubling down even further. In a move by my Delaware colleague, Senator Coons aptly calls the devil's deal. You see, international sanctions, global isolation, and a determined Ukrainian military have left Putin scrambling for military supplies and weapons. He first turned to help from one of the world's worst rogue nations. You might have heard Senator McConnell talk about Iran earlier. That's right, while the Iranian government was beating, murdering, and repressing mass protesters who were demanding basic freedoms, Putin was there hat in hand pleading for military weapons. And just last week, what classic photographs these are. He turned and asked for help from Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea. It is hard to imagine a more deadly duo than these two. While the Iranian government was doing these things, he's pleading for weapons, and now he's met with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, further requests for weapons. His effort to restore Russian glory has instead resulted in pleading for help from two global despots and fostered NATO enlargement along Russia's border. That's the thing that we've got to keep in mind that has been achieved by this war. There is more unity in the NATO alliance than any time in its history. In fact, for the first time in recent history, we have expanded NATO to include Sweden and Finland. It has been my good fortune to attend the Munich Security Council in Germany this spring and to meet again the President of Finland, President Niinisto. This morning's New York Times has an article which I commend to you, and I ask unanimous consent to include in the record.
Without objection.
Of September 18th, New York Times. And the Finnish leader, President Niinisto, now serving his second term, made an historic decision to ask for membership in NATO. He's a wonderful man. He's on his second term, extremely popular in his country, and he asked to join the NATO alliance so that we could stand up against Putin. He reminds us in this article that Finland has a great experience with its neighbor Russia and an 830-mile border with the Russian leadership. He recalls Finland's numerous wars with Moscow, including the 1939 Winter War and World War II, when the Finns fought off the Soviets but had to cede territory. Mr. Niinisto said European countries that let down their defenses after the collapse of the Soviet Union made a grave mistake. And so he is asked to join the alliance. I was at a meeting with President Denisto, and he said he picked up the phone one day and called Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But he said, I told him point blank, I'm joining the NATO alliance. Putin said, you don't have to, I'm not going to invade your country. He said, I can't trust you anymore after what you've done in Ukraine. And that's a message that Zelensky was delivering last night on 60 Minutes, and I want to make clear on the floor. Putin is not going to stop his ambition to acquire other countries. And there are many that are in fragile, dangerous situations. I'm blessed to represent the state of Illinois and the city of Chicago as the presiding officer does. And there's some wonderful groups of people who've come to that state and that city and have made us what we are today. Among them are the Polish people. They say that Chicago is the second largest Polish city in the world next to Warsaw. It's probably true. They're great folks. I'm honored to represent them. They know what Soviet occupation through the Warsaw Pact meant to Poland, and they understand the danger if Putin is successful in Ukraine. The neighbors to Poland feel the same way, the Baltic nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I have a special connection there. My mother was born in Lithuania. I've been there many times, and I greatly admire the people of all the Baltic states. But they are small countries. They couldn't stand a chance of fighting off Vladimir Putin if he decided to invade them. The point made by Denisto, the point made by the NATO alliance, the point that President Biden is making, and I might add many Republican leaders like Senator McConnell, is it is our best interest to stop Putin now in Ukraine, because he has ambitions that reach far beyond the borders of that country. The United States is not sending troops. We are sending military equipment, artillery, ammunition, and we're giving advice to the Ukrainians so that they can win this battle. This battle is not just for Ukrainian sovereignty, it's for our own protection in the years to come. This week in Washington, we'll be visited by President Zelensky of Ukraine. He'll go to New York first to address the United Nations General Assembly. I think he's come through with a clear message to global leaders, to NATO, and to Congress, and to the American people. Quite simply, Ukraine is fighting with the lives of its own people against a nuclear state, Russia, that threatens the world. If Ukraine falls, Putin will certainly go further, to Poland, to the Baltic states, and trigger an even wider war. Putin cannot be changed, but he can be stopped in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are showing extraordinary courage and determination. I agree with President Zelensky. We must continue our support for these brave people, fighting for their country and against Russian tyranny that threatens the world. We can start by passing the Biden administration's most recent funding request. I am going to do my part in the Senate to make sure we get that done and call on my colleagues to do the same. I would say to President Zelensky, your message was delivered in 60 minutes. You are looking for allies who will stand up against the aggression of the war criminal Vladimir Putin. The United States and NATO will be those allies. Madam President, I yield the floor.